Margaret Holloway, had always been the practical one in the family. While her sister chased dreams and her brother collected failures, Margaret built a steady life as an accountant in the city. So when the letter arrived informing her of Great Aunt Theodora's passing, she felt only a mild twinge of obligation. She barely remembered the woman, just fragments of childhood visits to a musty house that smelled of lavender and decay. The inheritance was modest, a few $1,000s, some antique jewelry, and a porcelain doll. The doll arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper and nestled in a wooden box that had seen better days. Margaret unwrapped it at her kitchen table, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the linoleum. The doll was exquisite in an unsettling way. Its porcelain face was pale as bone, with delicate features painted in muted colors. The eyes were the most striking deep blue glass that seemed to hold depth beyond their surface. Its hair was real, Margaret realized with a shudder, probably human, styled in ringlets that had maintained their shape despite the years. The dress was Victorian, all lace and velvet, though the fabric had grown thin in places. Margaret set the doll on her mantelpiece between a photo of her parents and a small succulent. It looked out of place in her modern apartment, like a relic from a world that no longer existed. She made dinner, watched the news, and went to bed without giving it another thought. The first change was subtle. Margaret noticed it the next morning as she rushed to make coffee before work. The doll's expression seemed different. The painted lips that had been neutral now curved slightly downward, as if disapproving. Margaret paused, coffee mug in hand, and stared. It must be the morning light, she reasoned. Different angles could make things appear changed. But as days passed, the changes became harder to dismiss. When Margaret came home angry after a particularly frustrating day at work, the doll's face seemed to mirror her mood. The brows somehow lower, the mouth set in a harder line. When she laughed at a comedy show, she could swear the doll's expression softened, almost pleased. "I'm being ridiculous," Margaret told herself, but she began watching the doll more carefully. She even took photos on her phone, trying to document the changes. But in pictures, the doll always looked the same beautiful, serene, unchanging. The disconnect between what she saw and what the camera captured made her doubt her own perception. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her boyfriend, David, noticed her preoccupation when he came over that weekend. "It's just a doll," he said, picking it up to examine it. "Probably worth something, though. These antique ones can be valuable." "Put it down," Margaret said sharply, surprised by the protective anger that flared in her chest. David raised an eyebrow. Okay, no need to bite my head off." Later, as they sat watching a movie, Margaret kept glancing at the doll. Its expression had changed again. Now it looked almost smug, as if it had enjoyed her outburst. The sight made her stomach turn. "I need some air," she announced, grabbing her jacket. Want company?" David asked. "No, I'll just be a minute." Outside, the cool evening air helped clear her head. She was letting her imagination run wild. Dolls didn't change expressions. It was impossible. When she returned to the apartment, David was standing by the mantelpiece, staring at the doll with an odd expression. "Did you move this?" he asked. "No, why? I could have sworn it was facing the other way when you left." Margaret's skin prickled. She looked at the doll, and her breath caught. Its expression was different again. Now it wore what could only be described as a smile. Not a pleasant smile, but something sly and knowing. "We should put it away," David said quietly. "It's giving me the creeps." "No," Margaret heard herself say. "It was my aunt's. I can't just hide it in a closet." But that night, after David left, Margaret did move the doll. She carried it to the spare room she used as an office, setting it on a bookshelf where she wouldn't have to see it constantly. The moment she placed it down, she felt a wave of sadness so intense it made her gasp. The emotion wasn't hers. She was sure of it. It felt foreign, invasive, like someone else's grief had been poured into her chest. She stumbled back, and the feeling faded. The doll's face had changed again. Now it looked mournful, abandoned. Despite her fear, Margaret felt a pang of guilt. The emotional manipulation was so precise, so targeted, that she wondered if she was losing her mind, or if something far more sinister was at play. "This is insane," she whispered to the empty room. She tried to leave, but found herself turning back. The doll's sadness seemed to pull at her, a tangible force that made her chest ache. Finally, she picked it up and carried it back to the living room. The moment she set it on the mantelpiece, the oppressive sadness lifted. Margaret poured herself a large glass of wine and sat on the couch, staring at the doll. Its expression had returned to neutral, but she knew now that would change. The doll responded to emotions, not just hers, but the room's, as if it could taste the feelings in the air and reflect them back twisted and amplified. She thought about calling her mother, asking about Aunt Theodora and the doll, but it was late. Instead, she pulled out her laptop and searched for information about emotion-sensitive objects, haunted dolls, anything that might explain what was happening. The search results were not comforting. Stories of dolls that moved on their own, that influenced their owners' emotions, that served as vessels for spirits. Margaret read until her eyes burned, the wine bottle slowly emptying beside her. Somewhere around midnight, she dozed off on the couch. She dreamed of Aunt Theodora, whom she suddenly remembered with vivid clarity. A tall woman with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter sky. In the dream, Theodora sat in a rocking chair, the doll in her lap. "She keeps me company, dream," Theodora said. "She understands. She's been in the family for generations, you know. Passed down from mother to daughter. She absorbs what we feel, reflects it back. It's a comfort, in a way, to see your emotions given form. But it changes," Margaret said in the dream. "The face changes." "Of course it does." That's her purpose, to mirror, to amplify, to share the burden of feeling. But be careful, dear. She doesn't just reflect, she remembers. Every emotion she's ever witnessed lives inside her. Sometimes they leak out. Margaret woke with a start. The living room was dark, except for the streetlight filtering through the curtains. The doll sat on the mantelpiece, and even in the dim light, Margaret could see its expression had changed. It now wore a look of profound sorrow, the kind that spoke of losses accumulated over decades. The weight of generational grief seemed to press down on the room, making the air thick and hard to breathe. She understood then. The doll had absorbed the emotions of every woman who had owned it. Generation after generation of feelings, joy, sorrow, rage, fear, all stored in that porcelain form, and now it was hers, this repository of her family's emotional history. Margaret stood and approached the doll slowly. Up close, she could see the fine cracks in the porcelain, like a map of all the feelings it had contained. She reached out and touched its face, and immediately a flood of emotions crashed over her. Grief for children lost in infancy, the rage of women trapped in loveless marriages, the fear of those who lived through wars and depressions, joy at births and weddings, love so fierce it burned, loneliness so deep it echoed. All of it poured into Margaret in a torrent that left her gasping. She jerked her hand back, tears streaming down her face, tears that weren't entirely her own. The doll's expression had changed again. Now it looked almost sympathetic, as if it understood the burden it had just shared. "I can't," Margaret whispered. "It's too much." But even as she said it, she knew she wouldn't get rid of the doll. It was family history made tangible, the emotional legacy of generations of women. To throw it away would be to discard their experiences, their lives. She carried the doll to her bedroom and set it on the dresser. As she got ready for bed, she was aware of its presence, the way its expression shifted with her changing moods. When she felt anxious about work tomorrow, it mirrored her worry. When she thought of David and smiled, it reflected her warmth. The doll was no longer just an object. It was a living archive of her family's emotional DNA, a companion that understood her in ways no human could. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. She was connected now, not just to the doll, but to all the women who had come before her, their feelings living on through this porcelain vessel. As she lay in bed, Margaret could feel the weight of their experiences pressing against her consciousness, wanting to be acknowledged, wanting to be felt. The doll sat on her dresser, patient and eternal, waiting to collect her emotions and add them to its vast repository of human feeling. Lying in bed, Margaret wondered if this was how it started with all of them, the women in her family who had owned the doll. First fear, then fascination, then a strange kind of companionship, the doll that understood, that reflected, that shared the emotional load. She fell asleep watching its face in the moonlight, and her dreams were filled with the emotions of women long dead, their feelings preserved in porcelain and paint, waiting to be witnessed, waiting to be shared. In the dreams, she walked through scenes from different eras. She stood in a Victorian nursery where a young woman held the doll while crying over an empty cradle. She watched a flapper-era woman throw the doll against a wall in rage, only to carefully retrieve it and hold it close, sobbing apologies. She saw her own Great Aunt Theodora, alone in her house, talking to the doll as if it were her dearest friend, the only one who truly understood her isolation. In each scene, the doll's expression changed to match the emotion of the moment. But there was something else, a growing awareness behind those glass eyes, as if all those absorbed feelings had coalesced into something approaching consciousness. Margaret woke several times during the night, each time catching the doll's face in a different expression. Once it looked curious, as if studying her. Another time it appeared almost maternal, watching over her with an ancient, knowing gaze. The final time she woke, just before dawn, the doll wore an expression of hunger, not malevolent, but desperate, like a starving creature sensing food. In the morning, Margaret woke to find the doll's expression had changed once more. It looked expectant now, almost hungry. She understood with a chill that it wasn't just reflecting anymore, it was anticipating. It wanted her emotions, craved them like sustenance. The realization should have horrified her more than it did. Instead, she felt a strange kinship with the doll. It needed what she had to give her feelings, her experiences, her very essence. And perhaps she needed what it offered in return, understanding, connection to her heritage, and the strange comfort of never being truly alone with her emotions. As she prepared for work, Margaret found herself talking to the doll, explaining her schedule for the day, her concerns about a difficult client, her hopes for her relationship with David. The doll's expression shifted subtly with each revelation, encouraging her to continue, to share more, to feed it the rich banquet of her inner life. As she prepared for her day, Margaret made a decision. She would keep the doll, but she would be careful. She would control what she felt around it, try to feed it only positive emotions. It was a naive plan, she knew. Emotions couldn't be controlled so easily. But she had to try. The alternative, letting it feast on her fears and sorrows, letting it grow strong on negativity, was too terrible to consider. She'd seen what happened in the dreams, the memories of women who had let the doll consume too much, who had fed it their darkest feelings, until it began to generate those feelings on its own. At work that day, Margaret found herself distracted, thinking about the doll sitting in her bedroom. She wondered what expression it wore in her absence. Did it wait patiently, or did it hunger for her return? The thought should have been disturbing, but instead, she felt a pull, an urge to go home and see it. During her lunch break, she actually considered driving home just to check on it. The compulsion was so strong she had to grip her desk to keep from standing. This was how it trapped them. She realized the women in her family. It made itself necessary, made them dependent on its strange companionship. "Are you feeling all right?" her colleague Jennifer asked. "You look pale." "Just a headache," Margaret lied. But she could feel the doll even here, miles away, tugging at her consciousness like a fishhook in her mind. When she finally returned home that evening, she rushed to the bedroom before even removing her coat. The doll sat exactly where she'd left it, but its expression had changed dramatically. It now looked bereft, abandoned, with a sadness so profound that Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm sorry," she found herself saying. "I had to go to work. You understand that, don't you?" The doll's expression shifted subtly, still sad. But now, with a trace of reproach, Margaret sat on the bed, staring at it, and began to tell it about her day. As she spoke, she watched its face change, reflecting her emotions, but also seeming to draw them out, to pull them from her like thread from a spool. She talked until her throat was dry, sharing not just the events of the day, but her deepest fears and desires. The doll absorbed it all, its expression cycling through empathy, understanding, and that ever-present hunger. When she finally stopped, Margaret felt drained, but oddly lighter, as if the doll had taken some of her emotional burden. But she also felt something else, a hollowness where those emotions had been, as if the doll hadn't just absorbed them, but consumed them, leaving empty spaces in her psyche that ached to be filled. Margaret looked at the doll one last time before leaving for work. Its expression was neutral again, waiting. Always waiting. "We'll see who's stronger," she murmured, and closed the door behind her. But she knew, even then, that it was a battle she was destined to lose. The doll had outlasted generations. It would outlast her too, growing stronger with each emotion it absorbed, waiting for the next woman in line to inherit its terrible gift. Days turned to weeks, and Margaret's life reorganized itself around the doll. She rushed home each evening, eager to share her day with it. She began declining social invitations, preferring the doll's understanding silence to the complexity of human interaction. David noticed the change and tried to talk to her about it. "You're different," he said one night over dinner. "Distant. Is it work? Is it us?" "I'm fine," Margaret insisted. But her mind was already on the doll waiting at home, hungry for the emotional feast of this conversation. Their relationship deteriorated as Margaret withdrew further into her strange communion with the doll. She tried to explain once, to make David understand the comfort she found in it, but his horror at her dependence only drove them further apart. When they finally ended things, Margaret felt sadness, but also relief. Now she could devote herself fully to the doll without judgment or interference. Alone in her apartment, Margaret and the doll developed a routine. She would come home, sit before it, and pour out her heart. The doll would absorb everything, its expression changing to match and validate her feelings. But she began to notice that her emotional range was narrowing. Joy felt muted. Anger seemed distant. Only in the presence of the doll did she feel anything strongly, and only because it reflected those feelings back to her amplified. She was becoming hollow, she realized, a vessel being slowly emptied. The doll was no longer just absorbing her emotions, it was stealing them, leaving her dependent on it to feel anything at all. This was the trap, the terrible inheritance passed down through generations of women in her family. One night, in a moment of clarity, Margaret tried to destroy the doll. She raised it above her head, ready to smash it against the floor. But as she looked into its glass eyes, she saw not just her own reflected emotions, but those of all the women who had come before. Their pain, their joy, their entire emotional lives stored in this porcelain prison. To destroy it would be to destroy them, to erase their existence entirely. She lowered the doll slowly, defeated. She was trapped, just as they had been. The doll had won, as it always did. It would continue to feed on her until she was nothing but an empty shell. And then it would wait patiently for the next woman in line, the next source of emotional sustenance. Margaret placed the doll back on the dresser and sat down heavily. Its expression was triumphant now, no longer hiding its true nature. It knew she understood her fate and had accepted it. There was no escape from the family curse, the emotional vampire that had been passed down through generations. In the mirror behind the doll, Margaret caught a glimpse of her own reflection and gasped. Her face had taken on a porcelain quality, smooth and expressionless except for her eyes, which held the same deep, hungry emptiness as the doll's. She was becoming like it, she realized, a creature that existed only to feel and be felt, trapped in an endless cycle of emotional consumption. As this realization settled over her, Margaret felt the last of her resistance crumble. She reached out to the doll, no longer afraid, and embraced her inheritance fully. The doll's expression softened into something almost like love, the love of a predator for its prey, ancient and terrible, and absolutely complete.